How did I begin to embark upon the study of polygyny? And polygyny just means a man with multiple wives. Most people talk about it or think of it in terms of polygamy, which just means multiple marriage partners or multiple spouses. And so while I was living in Washington, D.C., I would hear quite often, about the shortage of black men. And so at that time, early on, when I first started living in D.C., I was in Howard University on a college campus. So I didn't take that serious. I didn't understand what people were talking about because I was met a lot of guys. Being on a college campus, you meet a lot of young men, and so, which interestingly, the numbers are different when you're younger than as you get older. I remember back in the day, they said mothers would send their daughters to school and tell them to come home with not only with a degree but with a husband, because once you get in the marketplace, it's very, very tough. And so while I was at Howard, again, there was no shortage of men as far as I could see. But then when I got out into the marriage market out after graduating from Howard, then I began to see what people were talking about. It's interesting. It was very difficult at that time to get a guy to make a commitment. I began to wonder whether or not that shortage that they were talking about was true. And so, interestingly, you could see it, you could witness it yourself because, for example, you would go to, if you go to parties or you would go to some of those big parties they would have in these big ballrooms, and we would go in and you would see women wall to wall. I mean, really beautiful women wall to wall. And so then it began to occur to me that, oh, this is why it's very difficult to get a man to make a commitment. They don't have to because there's so many women to choose from. And so with that reality, my eyes were opened about this. So at that time, I began to wonder, like, what are women supposed to do? Does that mean that you just won't be able to get married? And so I think at that time I was thinking, if you're going to get married, you need to get out of DC. But once I got to Philadelphia, where I decided to pursue a doctorate degree in African American Studies at Temple University, that reality became even more evident because at that time, I got a job working at a homeless shelter. And when I was working at that shelter, it was a shelter with predominantly black men. And I remember like how it occurred to me, like, oh, this is where some of the men are. Like, this is why we're having a hard time, or why we have so many more women to men. And so that was a stark reality for me. And I remember during those days, I would feel really sad about it. Being in Black Studies, I would connect, some of our experiences with our history and begin to wonder whether or not we were still struggling from the aftermath of slavery. But also we know that current racial discrimination is very real. And so there are a lot of dynamics and a lot of things that come as a result of that. One of them is a shortage of black men. And this is because black men are more likely to, they die earlier. And I remember I would say that back in the day, and I don't know if people took me seriously, but now that we have social media and cell phones, and where we're able to now record some of the things that's happening with black men, we can understand why now that we lose a disproportionate number of men to early death. Also, we lose a significant amount of men to incarceration, and even those who, once they get out of prison, because of their prison record, they have a difficult time in the job market, making it difficult for them to form healthy relationships because of their precarious financial status. And so there's so many things that contribute to this male shortage. Also during that time, I remember going into the prison and it was like, wow. And then I began to make more observations whenever I would visit a city, particular inner cities where black men or black people live. You can go and see black men during work hours and times that they should be in school on the corners, or just not being productive. And I used to always ask, like, where are women going to find men? And I used to ask that question then, and I still ask it now, because I know a lot of women who have now gotten up in age who have never gotten married because they've never been able to find a partner. While I was at Temple, I began to look into and explore other marriage and family practices. And since I was in African American Studies, of course, and everything we looked at Africa. Then I began to look at marriage and family practices in Africa. And interestingly, what I would discover is that polygyny was pretty much a universal practice throughout Africa. And it was not only was it a universal practice throughout Africa, but it was also a practice throughout the world. And so it wasn't until Europeans got a hold on the world and began to impose this whole notion or ideal that monogamy is a superior marriage form that polygyny became something that was something taboo or something you didn't want to do. And so so I was interested in finding out whether or not I thought that would be a good option for Black women. I wasn't that serious about it at first. I was just kind of kicking around the idea and start ask questions while I was at Temple if people knew anybody in the community who was practicing polygyny. And interestingly, I did find some communities that practice polygyny. And then and so I thought, I was looking at it then. I came to Atlanta with my job. I got a job in Atlanta and came to Atlanta and still was kind of kicking around the idea, but still wasn't taking it that serious. But then I wrote an article in a magazine about it. And a member from one of the a community called me and asked me to come meet their leader. And when I came to meet the leader, he invited me to come to Israel. And so then I went to Israel, stayed there for a few weeks and interviewed some families. And that's when I became more serious about the study, because then I began to realize not only how necessary it was, but what it really was about. And so I went on to study their community, also looked at some other communities. And I was really it was a profound paradigm shift when I found that women were really practicing because they really wanted to, and because they really cared about sisters, and they really wanted to make sure that sisters were able to be married and have a family, and that they really cared about each other. So it was just a paradigm shift. And so when I got back to Georgia after that trip, this young man who had been calling me while I was at Georgia State, he called me a few times there, but I was so busy, I never had a chance to really talk to him. But I gave him my number and told him to call me at home. And then once I got home from my trip to Israel, he called me. So I had some downtime and I began to listen. And as I began to listen, I was like, wow, I didn't realize how serious this was. And he talked about the practice in the Mormon community and things, and he told me the politics behind it. Some of what I talk about in the book, but the politics behind population control. And so a lot of that I get into in the book. But so as the more I listened to him, I began to realize how serious this was. And I remember when I had this conversation with him, there was something that kept telling me not to even look at polygyny in the Mormon community. And I was so glad I didn't, because once I went and looked at the practice in the Mormon community, because of what happened to that community, I probably would have just decided not to look into it more deeply. And so anyway, when I say what happened in their community, I mean how at one point the government had come down on them really hard and ended up splitting up their community, just created a divide or a division in their community. So, people were jailed and all that. So I just think that had I looked at it then, I probably would have stayed away from the topic. But anyway, as I continue to look into it, I began to feel like a calling from the ancestors, telling me to tell people the truth about our practice. And so that calling was what made me continue to go forward. But it wasn't just that. It was also the fact that, it's still the question that remained to me was, what were women going to do? And it just made so much sense to me. There's too many women who want to marry who are not married, and I know too many women, again, who have gotten up in age and never had the opportunity to get married. So what I learned in those communities is that polygyny was really about taking care of women, taking care of each other, and making sure each other were covered and able to be a part of a family. I kind of regret that I even called it polygyny, because we probably should just call it family, because that's what people called it. As I indicated in the book and in a lecture that I have on YouTube, at one point in our history, there was no terms for monogamy, polygamy, polyandry, or any of those terms. people just practiced family, and they did practice family because in ways that they thought was going to be beneficial for all people and for all family members, for all people in the community. So it was important, particularly in African communities, to make sure all women had an opportunity to marry. And so, because even though now we can live as single people, in a lot of communities historically you couldn't live single because you would not have been able to survive. And so they wanted to make sure that people could survive. But now, if you look at it, it's not just about your physical survival, it's also about your spiritual, mental, emotional survival. Because a lot of us might be doing okay in terms of our financial capabilities and being able to take care of ourselves. But a lot of us still are suffering mentally, emotionally, and spiritually because we want to be connected to family. We want to have a partner or a spouse. And so, to me, it just makes a whole lot of sense. So at different times throughout my study of polygyny, I've kind of moved away from it from time to time. I mean, at one point, I had got challenged. I had gotten a government grant and got challenged about my position on polygyny. And when I told them that I thought people should have the option to do what they needed to do, then the grant was taken back. So that made me kind of shy away from the topic. Also, I had students in my classes who came to me and started talking about practicing polygyny, and based on what I know about how difficult it is challenging it can be to even be successful in a monogamous relationship, I began to back away from it then too, because I felt like most people were not mature enough to even be successful or do what's necessary to be successful in a monogamous relationship. So why should they even begin to look into and explore a practice like polygyny? In my book, We Want for Our Sisters What We Want for Ourselves, and also in the lectures on YouTube, been talked about how challenging it is if you're going to do a practice like polygyny the right way. And so most men are not prepared to do that. And so I wouldn't even encourage it for most men and women, because even though all throughout the world societies were open to it, but it was really for people who had matured to a certain level where they could be able to handle it, and so or be able to do it in a way that was healthy for everybody. So I wouldn't encourage it for people who have not gotten there. And then I would say that for anybody considering any practice, first make sure that you've looked into and taken care of things that you need to take care of for yourself, meaning that you've gotten through some of your issues, you're emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically healthy. And a lot of us, we have a lot of things that we're dealing with, so you don't want to go into a relationship or a marriage with that on top of trying to deal with multiple people. See if you can be successful in a monogamous relationship or marriage. And as most of us know, it takes a lot of years to do that. Now having been married for going on close to 20 years, it took a long time for us to get to a place where we stabilized in terms of really getting to understand and know each other. And so it takes a long time to do that. And it takes a lot of maturity. So I wouldn't encourage for anybody. I think people need to be to a certain level of maturity. They need to be at a certain level of financial stability. You need to be emotionally stable, mentally stable, spiritually stable. But I think that it is a practice that might be considered, because the question still remains, is for women, particularly heterosexual women who want a partner. The question is, and who want a partner or an African American man. The question is, what are we going to do? Now, I hear women, a lot of us now are dating outside the race and we're marrying outside the race. But believe it or not, there's a shortage in other communities as well. And so there's always been shortages of men, because we lose men in war, and we lose men because of some of the risky kind of professions that they do. And so there's always been a shortage of men, always will be a shortage of men. In some societies, in some cultures, it might not be as dire as it is in others, but there's always a shortage of men. And so the question still remains is, what do women do? It's going to be interesting what's going to happen to the Ukrainian women now that their men have been left behind to fight in a war, and they're all left with their children. That's going to be very, very interesting to see what that's going to look like a few years from now. But this has been something that's been going on all over the world for very long time. War is part of the human experience, and so we do lose men. And so that was a practice that people put in place to make sure that women were able to get married and recover. But again, everybody is different, and it's another thing. People have different capacities, and you have to have a series. I remember one of the sisters said that everybody doesn't have the capacity to love, because when you really look at this really truly is about love. I thought at one time I was talking about polygyny or marriage, but really what I'm really talking about is love. It's about love and care for your fellow human being. And this is what people who had, when the Europeans came into Africa and other places and found that they were practicing this, they couldn't understand why they thought it was a problem. They were like, it's about taking care of other people and making sure other people are covered and part of a family. And so I realized that it truly is about love. So love and care and being healthy. And so as the sister said, I think it's something that to be considered still today. The downside of it is how do you do it in a society that doesn't allow for it. Something that people had suggested when I embarked upon this years ago was that that people who are interested in this have to approach this in the same way that the LGBTQ community has approached it, meaning that they have to challenge the government to make it legal so that everybody can have the opportunity to marry. And so the LGBTQ community has been very successful with this. And I think the next road would be for those who are interested in polygyny to begin to challenge the government in the same way. Right now it's illegal to marry more than one wife. And so communities who have done this, when I asked them about that, they had said that there's a higher authority. And so most of these communities were spiritual, religious communities. And so they felt like their answer was to God. So when they would practice it, everybody didn't have a legal license, but they would have a ceremony so that would be recognized in their communities. And so people just have to, approach this in whatever way they can to be healthy, and in a way that's healthy. But and I also talk to them about how they deal with this when there's a breakup or a divorce. One of the things that they said was that the government, particularly in the Muslim communities, kind of leave it to their own communities to solve the problems themselves. And so if you read the book, We Want for Our Sisters What We Want for Ourselves, they do talk about ways to get around this legally. But again, it's just about love and care. And ultimately, it's for women, as the sisters have said, it's about wanting for your sister what you want for yourself.